So as I was preparing over the last week or so to speak to you, I was reminded of Admiral James Stockdale. And Admiral James Stockdale was many things. He was a decorated military aviator. He was an admiral, obviously, by the title. But he was also Ross Perot's running mate in the 1992 presidential election. And so during that presidential election season, there was a vice presidential debate. So you had the sitting vice president, Dan Quayle. Obviously, he's a sitting vice president, so people know who he is. The Democratic nominee for vice president was Al Gore, who was a senator. Everyone knew who he was, but no one knew who James Stockdale was. So when it was James Stockdale's time to give the opening statement, he stood up and he said, "Who am I? Why am I here?" And I'm definitely having that moment right now. I definitely had that moment. I definitely had that moment when I was asked to come speak to you this weekend. Well, who am I? Well, you've heard my introduction. I'm a judge. I'm also a deacon at the North Campus. And as you may know, deacons have deacons meetings every quarter or so. And at the last deacons meeting, at every deacons meeting, there's somebody who gives a testimony of how they came to Christ. And so I was asked to give my testimony. And Mark Terry, who's here from the North Campus, said, "Hey, just keep it short, 5 to 7 minutes. No need to preach a sermon." So I was somewhat successful in that. So I told my story. My testimony, as far as coming to Christ, is pretty simple. I was 7 years old, and I had a Christian babysitter that my parents hired for me. I don't know if they necessarily knew at the time that she was going to do this, but she would share me stories from the Bible with me, and I came to accept Christ. So I gave my testimony for about 5 minutes, and then for the last 2 minutes, I guess I got into prosecutor mode, and I started giving a closing argument about Jesus. And at the beginning of my testimony, I made a joke. I said, I've always wanted to come up on stage at a church and say, "Please open your Bibles." And I made another joke about the doors of the church being open. And I don't know if Dr. Young plays poker, but if you ever played poker with him, assuming he does, you probably shouldn't try to call his bluff, because he will definitely make that happen. So he said, oh, you want to say the doors of the church are open? Okay, well, we can find a way for that to happen. So here I am. But what prompted, thank you. So what prompted my testimony that night was my study of Genesis over the past year, and especially the study of Joseph. So what I want to talk to you about right now, just a little bit about Joseph, share a few verses with you, and then talk about sort of how I see those verses playing out in my life. So if you don't know the story of Joseph, Joseph is one of the 12 sons of Jacob. And Jacob is the son of Isaac, and Isaac's the son of Abraham. So Abraham is basically one of God's first people. And God makes a series of promises to Abraham about the land, the promised land, about I'll be your God, you'll be my people. He makes a covenant with Abraham. And those promises are repeated throughout the Bible, but also throughout Abraham's direct family. So Abraham has a son named Isaac. Same thing. God comes to Isaac and says, "Hey, I'm the God of your father Abraham. Here are the promises again." Isaac has Jacob, same thing. God comes to Jacob and says, I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of Isaac. I'm your God. Here are the promises. So now we're at Joseph. So we're at the fourth generation, I would say, of the promise. And the story of Joseph, in many ways, it is obviously an Old Testament story because it's in Genesis, but it feels like a New Testament story because the story of Joseph is about somebody who suffers, but in the end, he suffers to save people. And obviously, you don't have to know a whole lot about the Bible to know that Jesus suffered for us. And let me just tell you a quick story to lead up to the passage. So Joseph is Jacob's son. Jacob has 12 sons. Joseph is Jacob's favorite son, which is a cause of consternation in the family. The other brothers resent that Joseph is the favorite son. As a symbol of this favoritism, Joseph has this multicolored robe. And even people who have no idea anything about the Bible, there's a musical about Joseph and his robe. And so Joseph has this robe. Joseph also has the ability to interpret dreams. And early on in his life, he has a couple dreams that indicate that at some point in his life, His family will bow to him. His brothers already don't like him, and so when they hear, oh, by the way, not only do you not like me, but eventually you will bow to me, they aren't really big fans of that. One other thing you should know about the sons of Jacob, again, Joseph is one of the 12 sons, is that the sons of Jacob are, in a word, terrible. They do terrible things. They have done terrible things. They've lied to people. They've deceived people. They've killed a whole bunch of people. And so they're not good people. And one of the things that brings up is that God uses everyone, even bad people, even people who've done horrible, horrible things that no one in this room would contemplate. He still uses them for his purposes. So one day, Joseph is coming to see his brothers. The brothers are out in the field tending the flocks. Here comes Joseph. He's got this robe on, and his brothers say, here comes that dreamer. Let's kill him. Cooler heads prevail. All right, well, let's not kill him. Let's just throw him down the well, and then we'll sell him. So they throw him down the well. They strip him of his robe. They sell him off, and eventually Joseph arrives in Egypt. Meanwhile, the brothers come home, show their father the robe, and in the meantime, they've ripped the robe and dipped it in goat's blood, and they say, here, father, is this Joseph's robe? And Jacob's like, oh, no, yes, that is my son's robe. He must have been mauled by a wild animal and killed. No one corrects the misconception. They just let it ride. Joseph's off in Egypt, and as far as the brothers are concerned, they're done with him. So Joseph goes to Egypt. He serves in Potiphar's house. Potiphar is a high Egyptian official. He serves in his house so well that eventually he rises to the head of the household. However, you've probably heard this story. Potiphar's wife accuses Joseph of some improprieties, to put it mildly. And so Joseph is thrown in jail. While in jail, Joseph serves God. He interprets a couple dreams. He interprets the dreams of two different people, one of whom gets out and resumes his normal life. The other one gets out and gets beheaded. As Joseph is talking to the guy that's going to get out and be just fine, he says, hey, remember I'm here, put in a good word for me so I can get out of here. And that person, of course, promptly forgets that Joseph's there. Pharaoh has some dreams. He can't interpret them. And the person who had his dream interpreted in jail, who got out, says, hey, I know this guy named Joseph. He's in jail. He probably can interpret it. So Joseph interprets the dream. The dream basically says, hey, for the next 7 years, we're going to have a great harvest. Plentiful livestock, plentiful crops, but then after that, there will be 7 years of a famine. And Pharaoh eventually puts Joseph in charge of the kingdom. Joseph basically becomes the prime minister of Egypt. The Bible uses the word governor. So that's where we are right now for the verses I want to share with you. And what I want you to know, the 2 points I want to make that I would love for you to take away is that God uses people and circumstances to work his will in our lives. And we will see that through the passage. And I will ask you at the end to look back in your life, and I bet you will see that too. Second thing I want you to take away is that what sin corrupts, God redeems. God redeemed the corrupt purposes of Joseph's brothers, as we will see. And again, I think if you look back in your life at tragedy, at terrible things that have happened to you or people you've known, or quite frankly, maybe things you have done, I think you will see that God has redeemed those things. So first, what I want to do, not first, but what I want to do now is read to you Genesis 45, 3 through 8. And it begins, Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. When you hear about Joseph's story, it's easy to identify with Joseph because Joseph seems like a really good guy. Joseph has suffered. He's been mistreated. And as human beings, we often dwell on the ways we have been mistreated or we have suffered. And there are certainly messages to draw from Joseph's suffering, don't get me wrong. But a lot of the times we're not Joseph. A lot of times we're Joseph's brothers, and we've done things to other people that we should not have done. We've mistreated other people. And quite frankly, with our relationship with God, we're always Joseph's brothers. We're never Joseph in our relationship with God. We're the one mistreating God. We're the one breaking God's commandments. We're the one sinning against God, and God graciously forgives us for that. So I want to share with you a little bit about this passage. When I think of guest preachers, I'm reminded of when I was a teenager. We had a guest preacher at my church. I'm from Arizona partially, and so when I lived in Arizona as a teenager, I went to one of the largest black churches in Arizona, and one day we had Jesse Jackson come be the guest preacher. And if you're of a certain age, you know that church didn't always last just an hour or an hour and 10 minutes. Sometimes it was an hour and 45 or 2 hours. And so that day, as a restless teenager, Reverend Jackson got into the pulpit about 12 o'clock, and I sort of did the math in my head. Church started at 11, so I did the math in my head, and I said, well, normally we get out between 12:45 and 1. He did just run for president, so he's kind of a politician at this point, so maybe we'll get out about 1:15. So I thought, all right, well, 1:15, I guess I can make it. Well, at 1:45, he said, in conclusion, and that wasn't the conclusion. We didn't get in our cars till about 2:20. I promise I will not do that to you. But let's talk about these verses. So verse 3, Joseph says, I am your brother. And the brothers were terrified. Well, why were the brothers terrified? Well, there's one really obvious reason, and that's they haven't seen this guy in 22 years, and they threw him down a well and then told his father that he was dead. So they're scared that he is going to exact revenge on them. The brothers are in Egypt to get grain because, again, as I said, there was going to be a famine, and there was a famine at this point. And all the countries around Egypt were experiencing famine, crop losses, livestock losses, and the brothers come to Egypt to get grain. And they don't know that it's Joseph that's the grain administrator, the governor, the prime minister. And so when they find out, oh my gosh, the prime minister of Egypt, in whose hands it is that dole out this grain, is the brother that we mistreated, they're thinking we're going to die, he's going to mistreat us. The best case scenario probably is, well, he's just not going to give us grain. The worst case scenario is he's going to treat us like we treated him. But the less obvious reason that the brothers are afraid is because they don't know, or they haven't internalized, that God has a plan here. All they see is their fears. Why is Joseph being so kind? Because Joseph knows that God has a plan. Joseph's had 22 years away from his brothers after having been thrown down the well and been mistreated and falsely accused. Joseph doesn't let go of God, and Joseph knows that God has a plan for him. So when he embraces that plan, when we embrace the fact, we may not know what the plan is, but when we embrace the fact that God has a plan for us, it helps wipe away those fears, and we don't act out of fear at that point. We act out of faith. Another point here is that, again, the brothers have treated Joseph really badly, and one principle we can draw from this is that no one is too bad to be forgiven. There's nothing you've done that cannot be forgiven. God uses flawed, sinful people to do his work, and God forgives flawed, sinful people. And God is always at work, and God is always in control, and the story tells you that because the whole point of throwing Joseph down the well was to get rid of him, was to be done with him. By throwing Joseph down the well, the brothers just got more of him later on and got blessed. In a causal relationship here, they were blessed by throwing him down, which is not an advertisement, obviously, to mistreat people, but it shows the power of God that he can turn corrupt motives into something greater. They tried to kill the dreamer, but instead they made the dream come true, and that's one of the things we can take from this story. In verse 4, Joseph says, "Come close to me. I am the one you sold into Egypt." And there's lots of parallels between Joseph and Jesus. That's probably, you could probably do a 5-part sermon series on that, but I will say this. When we come to Jesus, sometimes we're going to have to confront, well, not sometimes, we're going to have to confront our sins. You can't be forgiven if you don't acknowledge what you've done. And when we acknowledge our sin, it's not fun, it's not pleasant. If you look back on your life at the sinful episodes in your life, that's not enjoyable. But then look what Joseph does in verse 5. He says, do not be angry or distressed. Actually, he says, and now do not be angry. So he's gentle. Again, Joseph is the second most powerful person within hundreds of miles. And he has the power of life and death over his brother. And it would be entirely human for him to take revenge on his brothers. It would be entirely human to say, first of all, if you go back a few chapters, the brothers wound up bowing to Joseph. But they didn't know who he was. This would have been a perfectly human time for Joseph to say, remember when you bowed to me a few weeks ago? Remember when I sent you back and now you're back again? I told you go back home and then come back, and now you're here. I've been telling you what to do. You've been doing exactly what I've wanted you to do, and now you're scared because now I'm here and I can exact revenge. Obviously, that wouldn't be the way to do it. We wouldn't have condoned that, but we would certainly understand that. But instead, Joseph says, "Do not be angry or distressed," and he says, "And now." And what that "and now" means is not only now, but it takes into account the fact that previously they could have had this. Previously, when we sin, we're always able to go to God. We're always able to go to Jesus and ask for forgiveness. And if you didn't do that last week or the week before, or if I didn't do that last week and the week before, and I can tell you I didn't, but there are times where we just missed the boat on that, it's still available now. And so just remember, it's always available. You're never too far gone for God. You're never too far gone for forgiveness. Verse 6, Joseph says, God sent me ahead of you to save lives. And I think one of the notable parts about this verse is that he says, God sent me. He didn't say, y'all threw me down the well. You guys did this to me. I was horribly mistreated. He said, God sent me. And what that says is that he knows that God's in control. This is the second or third year of the famine, and God knew what he was doing. And God was positioning Joseph for this time so he could save these brothers. Remember, these brothers are part of the people that God promised Abraham. Most of these brothers will wind up being the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so God is going to provide a way to keep his people going, and this is how he provides the way. These are the people he has provided. Again, these are deeply sinned and flawed people, and God is still going to use them. Judah is one of Joseph's brothers. Judah is one of the sons of Jacob. Judah is going to be one of the heads of the tribes. Judah is in the line of Jesus. If you read Matthew, the beginning of Matthew talks about the genealogy of Jesus, and Judah is in there. Judah did some terrible things, not just with his brother, and I'll give you the PG version of it, but Judah had 2 twin boys. He was their father, but in a way, he was also their grandfather, so you might want to go back and read that. It's an interesting story. But what Joseph is focusing on here is God, not man. Joseph is saying God is the prime mover. God is the one that makes these things happen. These things don't happen to me through people primarily. They happen from God primarily. And then in verse 7, Joseph says again, he sent me to preserve a remnant and to save by a great deliverance. Again, God sent me, not these things are happening to me or these people are mistreating me. God sent me. Again, God is purposely positioning Joseph to save people. And God is positioning each one of us in this room and online to help save people. Because God's plan for us is to be saved. And we are the people who assist God in this effort. We don't save people ourselves necessarily, but we bring the gospel to people. We either tell them about Jesus or we act in a manner that people see Jesus through us. So when you're suffering, it stinks. I don't like suffering. I don't like, somebody talked about the 4 Ds the other day: death, disease, dread, and disappointment. And we're all going to fall into one of those camps. Eventually, we're all going to die, but we're all going to experience those things in our lives, and those are not pleasant things. But God can use those times And if you're going to go through it anyway, you might as well learn something from God during those times, and you might as well have faith in God in those times, and you might as well trust God in those times. Because I don't know about you, but when I've tried to fix things myself, it doesn't quite work out the way I want it to. So then in verse 8, Joseph says to his brothers that God made Joseph the father to Pharaoh, lord of his household, ruler of all Egypt. And again, you see God uses a pagan leader. The Egyptians believed in all kinds of gods, but they didn't believe in the one true God. And yet, God used Pharaoh. God used Potiphar. Not only that, Potiphar, when Joseph worked for Potiphar, Potiphar was blessed, and he was blessed because Joseph was working for him. And Potiphar saw that God was on Joseph. Pharaoh saw that God was on Joseph. And one of the lessons for us is that people, even people who are hostile to Christianity, we all know people in this room who are hostile to Christianity that we're friends with or we're acquaintances with or we work with. And they're watching. They're watching to see if we're walking this walk. And that's not an invitation to legalism, and that's not an invitation to act like you're better than you are, but it is an invitation to show who Jesus is in your life. And that's what we need to do. People need to see Jesus through us. What I tell the men in my Bible study is sometimes you may be the only Jesus somebody sees that you know. That's it. They might not crack a Bible, they might not hear anything else, but if they know you're a believer and you're the only believer they know well, you're it. You're the one that's being sent to save lives. And we need to take that seriously, and we need to take that not just as a challenge, but as a joyful challenge, that we have the opportunity to share Jesus with others. So the end of the story, brothers, you've seen in these verses the reunion. Joseph says, hey, go back and get dad, and then bring the whole family to Egypt. The whole family comes to Egypt. They settle in Egypt as shepherds. They prosper. Everything's great until it's not. But they all come to Egypt. They all settle. When Jacob dies, Joseph's brothers come to him and they're like, okay, are you going to get your revenge on us again? Because now that dad's gone, you kind of have a free shot at us. And Joseph says, he sums up his life. He says to his brothers, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. And he does not take revenge on them. And they prosper in Egypt. So who am I and why am I here? These verses were important to me because it gave me an opportunity to look back on my life. So again, I was saved when I was 7. I went to a Christian school for elementary school, and my joke with Dr. Young was our Christian school was so hardcore conservative and fundamentalist that even Dr. Young would be like, you guys, whoa, let's ease up a bit. But it's a great lesson to me as a father of 3 children. My daughter Marilyn is 11. And I remember some of the things, even when I was younger than she is now, I still remember some of the things they taught me at Christian school 40-something years ago. And that's a great lesson to me because your kids are listening. And when you teach them about the Bible or they see how you react to situations in life, they remember those things. And those things stand out. And you think, well, I'm just their grandfather, or I'm just their uncle or their cousin or whatever. But they are paying attention. So I was raised in a church home. We went to church pretty much every Sunday. And then I went to college and I didn't really go to church anymore. I still prayed, but I would say my prayer life was more of an ATM prayer where you punch in the code and hope some money comes out, or you punch in the code and hopefully you get an A- on that exam. When I left college, I moved to Washington, D.C. for 2 years, and I had a plan. And my plan was I was going to go to law school. I was going to live in D.C. for 1 year, and then if you know anything about the geography of Washington, D.C., right across the river is Virginia. There's lots of people live in Virginia but commute into D.C. And so I moved to Virginia, and the reason why I moved to Virginia is because Virginia has one of the greatest law schools in the world, and I thought, I'll move to Virginia, apply to University of Virginia Law School, I'll get in, and everything will be just fine. And I actually had one of their most famous alumni write me a letter of recommendation. It's going to be great. And so that spring of 1996, I'd applied to several schools, so the acceptances are coming in. And if you're familiar with college admissions in the 80s or 90s, you looked for the thick, big envelope. If you got the thick, big envelope, it meant you got in because they had to send you all the other information, most importantly from their point of view of where to send the check. But they'd send you the big envelope. And so I started getting big envelopes from other schools, and then one day I went to the mailbox, and when you get a bill in the mail, it's a little envelope. It's like this. And so went to the mailbox, bill, and they're all little envelopes. Bill. University of Virginia is the return address. It's a small envelope. I guess it's not going to work out. But thankfully, earlier that year, I met my parents for Thanksgiving, and my mother said, "Hey, sure are applying to a lot of expensive private schools for a guy that wants to work for the government, and if you go to an expensive private school, the government's not going to be able to cover the cost of your student loan payments. You might want to consider applying to a state school." And I was, to be perfectly honest, annoyed because I don't like being told what to do. That's why I'm a judge. So, but to keep the peace, and so I wouldn't have to lie later on, I filled out an application for the University of Texas and sent it off and basically forgot about it. And yet, I wound up at the University of Texas, where thank you. And probably the most important, or maybe not the most important, but the one that obviously hits me here the most when you talk about people and circumstances moving in your life is that in my first year class on the first day of school, this woman over here was in there. And if you know anything about law school or graduate school, or you don't even need to know anything about that, just America in general, we like to make money in America. And when you're a first year in law school, your focus is getting really good grades so you can make some money. And so one day, there was a group of us talking right before final exams. We had an exam the next day, and everyone was talking, "Well, what are you going to do?" "Well, I'm going to go home and study." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to go home and study." A couple people changed it up and said, "I'm going to go to the library and study." It got to, she's my wife now. She was just a friend at this point. It got to her, and they said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And she says, "I'm going to go to Bible study." And they said, "Well, if you go to Bible study, aren't you worried that you're not going to do well in the exam tomorrow?" And she said, "I seriously doubt God's going to punish me for studying His Word." And I thought, isn't that interesting? And that taught me, or reminded me, that Christianity is often swims against the stream. Christianity is not, we sometimes think there was this golden age of Christianity. Christianity always goes against the prevailing culture. Loving your neighbor always goes against culture. Studying the Bible always goes against culture. And so I saw a vivid example of somebody who was not afraid to go against the existing culture. And we go back to my childhood where I went to church all the time, and I went to hardcore fundamentalist Christian school, but I learned how important God was. And again, if you told me when I was 15 that I was going to marry someone like this who loved the Lord and was willing to go to Bible study when people looked at her funny, I would have been like, sign me up for that. So it took me a while, but I did sign up for it. So, and I have to add to the story, because my daughter's favorite story about sort of how we started dating, there were a group of us that would eat lunch together at law school, and I wouldn't bring my lunch most days. And my wife noticed this one day. Again, we weren't even dating yet, and she would pack me an extra bag of Cheetos. So my daughter loves that story, but my daughter loves Cheetos too. So I don't know if it's about me or us or the Cheetos. But so we get married. I marry a godly woman. I start going back to church. Everything should be just great, right? Well, as you see countlessly throughout the Bible and in your own lives, you're not immune to suffering just because you're going to church. You're not immune to suffering just because you study the Bible. And that's not God punishing you in any way. God is preparing you through those times. We struggled to have a child. It took us a really long time to have Marilyn. And when I look back at those times, I think, one, probably a better father because it took us longer. If we had a child right away, I've had a pretty easy life. So if we had a child right away, I probably would have been like, oh, that's great. I mean, everything's going according to plan. When I see God at work, when my wife was diagnosed with cancer, that was not pleasant, obviously. And she's fine now, but 15 years ago when she was diagnosed with cancer, that was not a pleasant experience. But we leaned on God hard during those times. And again, God is maturing us through this suffering. My prayers went from gimme, gimme, gimme or here's my plan, rubber stamp it, God, or hey, something great happened to me, high five, God. My prayers went from that to your will be done. God sees over the horizon. God sees way down the road. We see 5 feet in front of us. And when we trust him and know that, we have peace in our lives. Now, the goal where I'm trying to get to is God use me anywhere, anytime, with anyone, for any reason that is yours. And sometimes I hit that, but sometimes I don't. But that's my prayer for you, is that you would pray that. So I want to wrap up. There's 2 things in my life that I shared at Deacon's testimony night that, again, Genesis 45 jogged my memory. The first is we have 3 kids. As Lee Maxey told you, 2 of them just turned 3 yesterday. And the reason why we have 3 kids, well, I don't know about the reason, but the path for that was we had a fundraiser at our house for somebody who needed money for an adoption. As you may know, if you've gone through adoption, it's pretty expensive. And at some point, that person says, hey, you guys should look into adopting. You said you wanted more kids, so you guys should look into it. And I thought, I'm 45 years old. I don't need to adopt any kids. I'm not potty training anyone anymore. This is great. And I said, no, well, just pray about it. And here's a hint. If somebody godly tells you to pray about something in a direction in your life, in my case, you empty out your retirement accounts, but to pay for adoption fees. But you really should consider that. So we prayed about it. We went to the meetings, and we signed up to be adoptive parents. Again, my daughter loves to tell the story that when we signed up, she said, well, we should get twins. And we're like, well, that's not the way it works. You don't just... It's not like Burger King. Like, you don't order the combo meal. You don't say, I'll take a number 3 and a Coke. Like, that's not how it works. And she said, no, we should get twins. Well, so then we got a phone call in May of 2018, and they said, well, are you sitting down? And yeah, and they said, well, you're having twins. So there you go. But that's God using lots of things. That's God using somebody in our lives to say, hey, you should pray about it. That's God redeeming an unplanned pregnancy. And again, that's a picture of how God uses things that you would say, ooh, that's not great. And he turned it into a great thing. We love those kids. And God used somebody else's need in our lives. So the second thing I want to talk about is the process of becoming a judge. It was New Year's Eve of 2015, and somebody said, hey, you should be a judge. And I said, well, I don't know about that. And they said, well, you should pray about it. And again, when someone says you should pray about it. So I ran for judge in 2018, and I lost. And my treasurer, who's Holly Roberts, who's a great, faithful woman of the Lord, sent me a text, and she said, if you knew what God knew, you would be happy at this result. And I thought, well, thanks, treasurer. But like many truths of God, or many truths that are God-inspired, it takes a while sometimes for you to absorb that, and she's absolutely right. So I lost in 2018, thought, well, I guess I'm just never going to be a judge ever. And then in 2019, there was a vacancy, and when there's a vacancy for a state court, for a district court bench, the governor selects that person. And so some people said, hey, you should apply. And I said, well, I don't think I want to do that, because politically I'd be a judge for 13 months and then I'd lose another election. I said, I'm 99.73% sure, I actually used that number. So I'm 99.73% sure that I am not going to apply for that. And then I talked to somebody and they said, you should pray about it. And so so here I am. So I was appointed to be a district judge in November of 2019. I lost that bench via election in November of 2020. And I didn't know what I was going to do. Started looking for jobs. My wife, as you heard, she went to law school with me. And I thought, well, she's at home with our kids. But I thought, well, maybe we'll put her to work. And but then in December of 2020, I was appointed to the position I am in. And that would not have happened had I done my plan, because my plan was run for judge and win in 2018. And when my plan didn't work out, then my plan was, well, I'm fine. I'm taking my toys and going home. I'm not going to do this. Again, God sees past where we see. God sees over the horizon, over the hills, over the obstacles in front of us. So who am I and why am I here? Well, I am God's child just like you. Hopefully, I'm here to serve him, to do his will, maybe even to save lives. And I don't mean in a literal, obviously, I went to law school, not medical school, so I'm probably not gonna be able to save anyone's life if something bad happens here. Maybe talk you to death to the point where maybe you just don't want to hear it anymore and you get up and walk away. But just remember you are God's child. Remember that you are God's servant. Remember that God uses people and circumstances in your life to work for his will in your life. Remember that God redeems things. So when you don't think you're smart enough or good looking enough or charming enough or skilled enough, God can use you. The greatest human being that's ever lived, and again, you want to talk about sermon series, forget Jesus for a minute, just put him to the side. The greatest human being that's ever lived has nothing that God needs. God doesn't need me to be a judge because, oh my gosh, who could possibly fill this role? He doesn't need me for that. But he has a plan for me. I don't know what it is. I mean, I enjoy the job I have, but I don't, maybe, who knows while I'm here? As my wife remarked to me when I lost in 2020, I said, well, it looks like I lost. And she said, well, maybe people just need to see what a Christian politician looks like when he loses. And I thought, well, why couldn't God find another Christian politician to lose? But you're not always going to know the answer. You're not always going to know why. Why this? Why is this happening? What am I supposed to get out of this? But if you know Jesus, you know what you need to know. How many times have you had an experience 20 years ago and then somebody is going through that same thing and you go, aha, I can help this person? That has happened. I'm sure that's happened to almost everyone in this room. God has a purpose for you, not for your glory, not for anyone else's glory, but for God's glory. So I want to leave you with this. It's a benediction from a former Senate chaplain. His name is Richard Halverson, and he says, you go nowhere by accident. Wherever you go, God is sending you there. Wherever you are, God has put you there. He has a purpose in your being there. Christ who indwells in you has something he wants to do through you, wherever you are. Believe this and go in his grace and love and power. Let's pray. Lord, I just ask that everyone in this room would trust you, not just that you're powerful, not just that you are mighty and that you have authority, but that you are good and faithful and that you have a plan and a purpose, Lord. I just ask that you be with everyone in this room this week and that they would come closer to you and to know you more. It's in your name I pray.